recapitulate, we discovered that the response of the early Christians to the great epidemics of 165 and 251 AD differed in important ways from their contemporaries. And we posited that what one believes makes a difference in how one responds. We traced the emergence of a new belief about disease and healing back to Jesus himself. Now, today, we are taking a further step. In the Gospels, Jesus is represented not only as a healer of physical disease, but also as a liberator from psychological torment. Suffering which in ancient text is described as spirit possession. I think this topic is especially relevant to this moment in our struggle with the coronavirus pandemic. After 3 months of self-isolation, nerves are beginning to fray. Many people are frustrated. Many people are depressed. The incidences of domestic violence, sadly, are on the rise. And so I think it is appropriate that we turn at this moment to two stories in the Gospel of Mark in which Jesus cast out demons, described as unclean spirits. Now, you may be wondering whether it is anachronistic to speak of spiritual possession in psychological terms. And if you have that well-founded doubt, let me recommend a book by a young scholar at Harvard Divinity School, which I had the privilege of publishing in a book series that I edit for Yale University Press. The author's name is Giovanni Bazzana, and the title of the book is Having the Spirit of Christ. The subtitle, Spirit Possession and Exorcism in Early Christ Groups, published this year, 2020. By the way, Pastor Charlie, in preparation for next week's class, I will be sending you a bibliography, a complete bibliography of all of the books that I've mentioned during our time together. Well, as it turns out, ancient text from the time of Jesus already recognize that spirit possession is a psychological illness. For example, Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century Greek writer, describes a Syrian exorcist who, quote, frees possessed men and women from their terrors by exorcising the spirits. And now listen to this. He restores them to health and sends them away normal in mind. The Greek verb is sophronein, which means reasonable. Of course, Lucian adds, delivering them from their difficulties for a very large fee. Plutarch, 1st century philosopher, the priest at Delphi, tells a story about a man named Dionysius, whom he describes as possessed, daimonon, and crazy, paraphonon. He says he suddenly jumped up when he was in the theater, tore off his mantle, ripped his tunic, and leaping up half naked, he ran toward the exit of the theater. Finally, recall the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, the story of the Gerasene demoniac. You remember? After Jesus liberates this tortured man from the legion of unclean spirits possessing him, he is then described in Mark chapter 5, verse 15, look at it, as, quote, clothed and in his right mind. So you see my point. Once it is recognized that ancient spirit possession was understood to be a psychological illness, then we can make what I believe is an illuminating cross-cultural comparison. So let me make this comparison briefly and ask you to think with me about it. In the Greek and Roman context, and especially among upper class persons, people who had an education, psychological illness was understood to result from a disorder of the elements that make up the soul. So Greek and Roman philosophers understood the soul to be composite. At the top of the soul was the mind, the nous, and lower down were desires, epithumii, and even further down were libidinal forces, passions. And a healthy soul, from the upper class perspective, is a soul in which the components are arranged hierarchically, in which everything is subject to the mind. And therefore, psychological diseases, athumia, which means depression, mania, madness, aponoia, which means desperation, paranoia, we still have that word, which means derangement. These and similar conditions were understood by upper class Greeks and Romans to result from a disorder in the soul. The disorder, the disarrangement, was caused by lupe, the Greek word for pain, which is understood broadly, not just as physical pain, but also as emotional distress, grief caused by loss. And therefore, the therapy for psychological illness was, in the upper class context, was not exorcism, but cognitive psychology, guidance of the soul to restore the balance. Let me give an example. The philosopher then was understood to be a soul doctor, and the philosopher was called in when a person began to behave strangely. There is an ancient text called the Axiochus. It is attributed to Plato, but Plato did not really write it. It's actually a text from the time of Jesus, the first century. And here's what happens. A man named Axiochus falls ill. He contracts a disease, and he almost dies. And after his close brush with death, he becomes madly depressed, and he locks himself up in his house. And so the friends of Axiochus, can you guess what they do? They go and get Socrates. And they say to Socrates, please come and administer the medicine of consolation to the soul of this sufferer. I'll give one more example. You're probably familiar with Cicero, the great Roman lawyer of the first century BC statesman. Well, halfway through his political career, Cicero's beloved daughter, Tullia, died in childbirth, like so many young women who gave birth too young. And Cicero was so depressed that he withdrew from political life. Can you imagine one of our politicians doing that today? He locked himself up in his country estate in Tusculum, and he applied the philosophical medicine, the cognitive psychagogy to his own soul. We know about it because he left a record of his struggle and his cure in 4 long books, which you can still read today. It's called the Tusculan Disputations. Now, I'd like to make my cross-cultural comparison. Among the subaltern populations of the Mediterranean, that is to say, among the lower classes, psychological suffering was understood to be caused by the invasion of a spirit, an unclean spirit. And this conception reflects the vulnerability of the oppressed. That is the social reality that underlies the understanding of psychological suffering among the lower classes. In fact, I encountered this for myself in January of 1992. Pastor Charlie, I took a group of 17 seminary students to the north of Brazil, and we traveled through the big cities of northern Brazil, Recife, Salvador. We wound up in Rio, and we went to worship at what was, at that time, the largest church in the world, Universal Kingdom of God Church. Imagine this, Pastor Charlie. They had 100,000 people worshiping there every day, 7 days a week. And can you guess what they specialized in? What drew people to the church? Demon exorcism. I took my students there. It was frightening, hair-raising. People would begin to sing and pray, and then all of a sudden, a possessed person would stand up in the middle of the worship service and cry out. And pastors who were standing around the walls of the sanctuary would rush to this person and begin the exorcism. And it was pretty clear to me the social and psychological mechanism at work here. The very poor living in huge favelas, ghettos outside Rio, they had internalized the message that was being sent to them by their society, namely, that their lives mattered nothing. And they internalized that negative self-judgment in the form of a belief in spirit exorcism. So my point is that it is the vulnerability of the oppressed that is the social reality underlying the phenomenon of spirit possession. Now, with all of that in mind, I would like to turn to the first of our two passages from the Gospel of Mark for today. And after that, I'll be opening it up for your questions and comments and discussion. So if you would turn with me for a minute to Mark chapter 1, verses 23 to 28. Jesus is in Capernaum, a little village in the lower tier of the Galilee. Here's my translation of verse 23. And immediately in their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit, anthropos in pneumati akatharto. Unclean spirit is a Jewish formulation with numerous parallels in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it probably reflects the story of the origin of such spirits as fallen angels, which goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 6, and which was popularized by apocalyptic texts like First Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. According to this popular story, the angels, you remember, had illicit sexual intercourse with mortal women. And the result was unclean spirits, spirits of impurity. That's the background of this expression found in the Gospel of Mark. Now look at verse 24. And he cried out, that is the possessed man. The Greek word is anakroxo, and it's one of those onomatopoetic words that sounds like what it is. Anakroxo. And he cried out, saying, what is there between you and us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Now notice here that the Spirit addresses Jesus first. Can I tell you something? This, so far as I know, is unique in ancient literature with regard to exorcism. In all of the other texts, it is the exorcist who speaks first. In Lucian's story, for example, the exorcist speaks first, asking the person how the spirit came to be in his body. In a first century Jewish writing called the Testament of Solomon, Solomon, who had the power to exorcise, speaks first, asking the demon, who are you? What is your name? Now, the crucial thing here in the Gospel of Mark is that the sufferer recognizes Jesus. He knows who Jesus is. Isn't that strange? How could that be? How can that be explained historically, psychologically? In my opinion, the best explanation that has been offered so far is in a wonderful little book by a Canadian psychologist who became a New Testament scholar. His name is John Miller. And he wrote a little book about 10 years ago called Jesus at 30. And in that book, John Miller hypothesizes that psychological sufferers were drawn to Jesus because they saw in him the resolution of the inner conflicts from which they suffered. I have to tell you, that rings true to me. In my own limited biographical experience, one of the most extraordinary spiritual leaders who I had the privilege of meeting was an old man named Vincent Harding, who taught at Iliff Theological Seminary and the University of Denver. He was a great old man, and when I went to meet him, to visit him for the first time, when I made the pilgrimage to sit at his feet in Denver, in those days before 9/11, if you came to pick someone up at the airport, you remember this? You could walk all the way down where? To the gate to pick them up. That seems unimaginable now. But so Vincent Harding, this wonderful old sage, walked all the way down to the gate to meet me. And as I came off of the plane, I looked up and saw him approaching. I'd never met the man before. We had never been introduced. But there was something about the way that he moved, his posture, that expressed his complete peace with himself and his environment. He had obviously, for me anyway, he had found the resolution of the inner conflicts from which I and others were suffering. And that's why I was drawn to him. Now look at verse 25. And Jesus rebuked the spirit, saying, "Be muzzled." The Greek word is phimotheti. It's a word that is found in the Greek magical papyri. It's found in binding spells. If you want to stop someone from gossiping about you, you would utter a phimotheti, a binding spell. So Jesus says, "Be muzzled and come out of him." Verse 26. And the unclean spirit convulsed him and cried out with a loud voice and went out of him. And now the last verse. And all were amazed, and they asked each other, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Now notice that in Mark's story, Jesus exorcises the spirit by a command. This is another point of contrast with accounts of exorcism in ancient literature. The most interesting one that I found in preparation for today is in the Antiquities of the historian Josephus. Josephus describes a certain Eleazar, a Jewish exorcist, who, in the presence of Vespasian, the emperor, and his sons, and a number of soldiers, freed a man possessed by demons. And this was the manner of the cure. He put to the nose of the possessed person a ring, which underneath its seal had one of the herbs prescribed by Solomon. And then, as the man smelled it, he drew out the demon through the man's nostrils. Then, wishing to convince the bystanders and to prove to them that he had this power, Eleazar placed a foot basin full of water a little way off and commanded the demon as it went out of the man to overturn it, and in this way to make known to the spectators that he had left the man. Well, at this point, I want to stop for a few minutes. I want to pause and ask what you have been thinking about. What questions have emerged in your mind? What observations you have about the cure of psychological disease, to which Jesus devoted himself in a major way. So, Pastor Charlie, if you will invite people to unmute themselves.
Great. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Dr. Welborn, I have a question about in that passage, the word spirit is the same word that we have for spirit in Acts and other places too. That sense of breath, and you were talking about how that through the nostril you seem to be getting that healing even.
It is.
Your connection both positive and negative with that same word spirit.
You are exactly right. The pneuma, right? Yeah. That's the Greek word. The pneuma is related to the breath, and it's because in the ancient world, and this is, back before Descartes, before the subject-object mind-body dualism, spirits, pneumata, were understood to be finely attenuated forms of matter. So the spirit was not something incorporeal, or it was not something that had no body at all. It did have a body. The body was simply very tenuous and fine, like a breath. All of this, of course, has a frightening resonance now during the coronavirus pandemic, now that we understand that the virus is spread by people breathing and sneezing and coughing. Good observation, Pastor Charlie. We're dealing with an ancient conception of the spirit world. Spirits could be both good and bad. Other comments, questions?
Doesn't seem to be an emphasis on touch in this account.
That's true, Jim. You're absolutely right. We noticed that when Jesus healed people who suffered from physical disease, there is always contact, touch, but not in the case of these cases of exorcism. Jesus cures by command. And I think that's because the spirit, the unclean spirit, is actually able to speak. It's able to talk to Jesus. And in both of the stories that we're going to look at this morning, it is the unclean spirit that initiates the dialogue. So the form of the healing takes the form of something spoken. The spirit speaks and Jesus replies. Good observation.
Dr. Welborn, I was talking earlier this week with an ICU nurse
Yes.
who deals with a lot of sedated patients, okay? And as a part of her training and her practice, these sedated patients, she talks to them, whispers to them,
Yes.
and also holds their hand or touches their arm. And the reason for that is that they found out that those patients, when they come out of being sedated, that they recover much more quickly and they regain their cognitive functions more quickly by the healing power of just the spoken word and the touch, even though they're, out of it, they're asleep.
You're absolutely right. I've never had the privilege or the opportunity to serve in that kind of nursing capacity, but I've had an experience like the one you're describing 7.5 years ago, when my own wonderful mother was dying. I traveled down to Arkansas, and by the time I got there, she had already lapsed into a coma. And on the last day of her life, somehow sensing that the end was near, I sat beside her bed continuously for the whole day and read her favorite passages of Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Just read them so that she could hear it, even though she appeared to be completely unconscious. And can you guess, Robert, what happened toward the end of that day? She woke up.
Mm-hmm.
She woke up and she looked at me and looked at my sisters and she spoke to us. So that's an experience I think that many people have had, is that the sound of the voice, right? The reassuring sound of the voice communicates with people even in extreme conditions.
Hearing may be the last sense to go.
Yes, that's exactly right. Other comments, questions?
We live in an age of affluence, or at least in our neighborhood, we do, our church. And I refer back to the famous passage in Ephesians 6:12. For our struggles not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And, we've got all of these things that appear to be spiritual forces working against us, and people give into addictions, 7 deadly sins, power and control over others through relationships. Just driving past Bill's Donuts is a spiritual battle for me.
No, I get your point exactly. And in my correspondence with friends who live in places all around the world, who have written to me expressing their concern for what is happening here in the United States, not only for the rapid spread of the coronavirus pandemic, but also for the social unrest and the animosity and polarization of our society. There is a deep wisdom, I think, in the scriptural recognition that the forces against which we struggle are spiritual. There is a spiritual dimension to the illness with which we're currently struggling. I think that's a profound point. Well, John, I can see your hand.
Yeah. Can you hear me? I guess you
I
can.
guess I can, yes.
You know, most of us, or when I grew up, I was very, I didn't believe much in this exorcism thing because I see TV preachers who do it over the TV or the radio or whatever, send me your money and that kind of thing. But when I was in the military, I was in Spokane and I stopped into the church, a Lutheran church, and the pastor related a story about his experience, and he seemed awed by it. He had served in a Native American reservation in South Dakota, and had a young woman that was there and a teenage girl who would she was just goofy, especially when she'd look in a mirror or anything. And he actually tried to deal with it spiritually, although he had doubts, he said, but it worked. So not all the exorcism stories are people pretending like they're goofy and then suddenly getting well for the benefit of getting money or whatever. And I saw a similar story when I was in Guam from a pastor who had been serving on the island of Yap, and he had dealt with a person who was having spiritual difficulties, but at the time the people were served by a shaman, and they were very upset with him and essentially wanted him to leave. But it does happen, and they're very moving stories when you hear them from somebody who feels really odd that it did happen and that God worked through them.
Yes, thank you for that. The book that I mentioned at the beginning by my young friend at Harvard Divinity School, Giovanni Bazzana, he begins his book with the story of a woman who came to the most recent unveiling of the Shroud of Turin in northern Italy. Have you heard this story? And the woman came along with other pilgrims and stood in front of the shroud, and all of a sudden she fell to the ground and began to speak in a strange language that no one could understand. Her body was convulsed and contorted, and after a few minutes, she stood up and walked away and left the church. The next day, Monday, the newspaper in the north of Italy, of course, reported on this dramatic event. And there was a commentary by a Catholic priest. He was an exorcist. And the priest offered the opinion that this woman could not really have been possessed by a spirit, because if she had, she would have attacked the shroud and she would have uttered blasphemies and profanities. Okay, 1 week later, an article appeared in the newspaper written by the woman herself, a woman from the countryside in northern Italy. And she wrote to the editor and she said, "Oh, yes, indeed, I was possessed by a spirit. And you should tell the exorcist that he is wrong to deny it." Well, I have to admit that on this question, of how psychological suffering is
Larry, we're having some connection issues again, so wait just a second, please. See if we
are understood differently from culture to culture. Pastor Charlie, I hope I'm not fading out.
You did for a minute there, so we're hoping that you're back together with us.
Well,
I think you're here now, so.
good. I will take then the next and final step into the text with my eye on the clock. The second story that I would like to look at is from Mark chapter 5, a very famous story, the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac. And you probably recall that this poor man is living. Where is he living? In the tombs. In ancient cities, the graveyard was on the outskirts of the city, along the roadway leading in and out of town. That's where this poor sufferer is living. He is sleeping in the graveyard. And this suggests that the spirit that was possessing the man was that of a violently killed person. In Greek, the word is nekoudaimon. Those who had suffered a violent death were understood to be restless. They were the restless dead who came back to haunt the living because they were envious of the living. And the usual means by which the restless dead harmed their victims was by causing madness. If you're interested in this, and this is another item, Pastor Charlie, that I will add to our bibliography, right here in Ohio, at The Ohio State University, is a scholar of the ancient world named Sarah Johnston. And she has a book called The Restless Dead, in which she explores the whole phenomenon of spirit possession by people who have died violently. All right, now let's look at the text. They went to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. Gerasa was a large Hellenistic city with a mixed population, Jewish and Gentile. And when he, that is Jesus, had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit encountered him, who made his dwelling among the tombs. And no one could restrain him, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces. And no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and up on the mountains, he was constantly howling and cutting himself with stones. I think it's almost impossible to imagine a more vivid portrait of a self-destructive individual, a person who is isolated, who cannot be brought back into society, and who is even harming himself, cutting himself with stones. There's a similar story in an ancient text called the Book of Marvels by Phlegon, in which he describes a young man who was possessed by an unclean spirit of depression, athumia, and eventually, sadly, the young man commits suicide. Look at the next verse, chapter 5, verse 6. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he cried out in a loud voice and said, now notice once again, the spirit-possessed person recognizes Jesus, and he speaks first. He cried out in a loud voice and said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I adjure you." The Greek word is horkizo, which means to bind with an oath. I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Do you see how the demon-possessed man here attempts a preemptive strike against Jesus? Very aggressive. For Jesus had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" Now, this is the turning point in the encounter between the man and Jesus. It is the discovery of the demon's name. And look how he replies. He replied, "My name is what? Legion, for we are many." Now, the name of this man, Legion, is of course a technical term. It designates a Roman military unit. The size of a Roman legion in the first century varied between 4,000 and 5,000 legionary soldiers. During the time of Jesus, Palestine was occupied. We actually know a great deal about it. It was occupied by Legion number 10 Fretensis. Legion number 10 Fretensis. It was assigned to Palestine during the time of Augustus. It was already present in Syria in 14 AD, and it was there to fight in the Jewish war when Jerusalem was destroyed. Can anyone guess what was the symbol represented on the legionary banner? Like all Roman legions, Legion number 10 Fretensis had a banner which it carried in front of it when it went into battle. Does anyone know what happened to be represented on that banner? It was the wild boar, a pig. And we're going to see how important that is in a few minutes, because as you may recall, Jesus sends the demons where? Into the pigs. There's a profound truth here, right? The truth about the connection between spiritual and political forces of oppression. There's a very interesting article in the British Medical Journal entitled "Tyranny and Mental Health," where the authors document the fact that in authoritarian societies, people suffer more from psychological trouble. Nelson Mandela confessed after he was set free from prison that while he was incarcerated on Robben Island, his mind constantly played tricks with him during the years of incarceration. Some of you may recall the beginning of the Arab Spring. How did it start? It started in Tunisia with a fruit seller named Mohammed Bouazizi. Do you remember what he did? He set himself on fire. He burned himself up because in the totalitarian regime in which he was living, he found that he couldn't make a living anymore. So he directed the violence against himself. In our Lutheran context, of course, all of us will recall that the German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer was imprisoned for his faith, for his act of conscience. And while he was there in Tegel prison, he wrote a little poem called "Who Am I?" I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but I would greatly recommend it. At one point in that poem, he says, "Am I really that which other people tell me? Or am I only that which I myself know of myself, restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath, as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colors, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for any act of kindness, for neighborliness, tossing night and day in expectation, powerlessly trembling for friends who are at an infinite distance, weary and empty at praying, at thinking, faint and ready to say farewell to it all." That's part of the poem of the great Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who precisely demonstrates the correlation between political and spiritual, political and psychological illness that we find in our text. And now let's finish our text. Chapter 5, verse 10. He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was on the hillside a great herd of swine feeding, and the unclean spirit begged him, "Send us into the swine. Let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and they were drowned in the sea. Well, of course, that's exactly where the people of Israel wanted to send the Roman legion. They wanted to send them over the cliffs into the sea. Whoever told this story reveals a surprising consciousness of the connection between political oppression and psychological, spiritual suffering. Now, you would figure, wouldn't you, that since this man has been liberated, the people of Gerasa, who had witnessed his prolonged suffering, you would think that they would be thrilled and rejoice. But look at the end of the story. The response of the Gerasenes. Swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion. And they were afraid. Those who had seen what happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. And then, listen to this, they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. Take your ministry of liberation someplace else. The economic cost is too great. The communal herd of swine has just gone over the cliff into the sea. So, in other words, the stock market in Gerasa has just crashed. And the people of Gerasa say to Jesus, please go away, leave our neighborhood. Once again, I'm astonished at the consciousness of the people who told this story. They understood full well the cost that had to be paid for the liberation of a single oppressed individual, that it has a social and economic cost. Years ago, when hospitals were defunded all across the United States, and when the mentally ill were put into homeless shelters and many times dumped out onto the streets, that's one of the great tragedies, I think, in our recent political history. And as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by the demons begged that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. Well, the lessons, I think, of this text are clear. The response of the Gerasenes indicates the economic cost of setting people free from psychological illness. We know that cost all too well here in Dayton. You remember at the end of August this past year, a young man who was suffering psychologically. His suffering was well known to his parents, friends, and teachers. He took a gun down into the Oregon district, and in 9 seconds, he killed 9 people and wounded 27? Well, I think there are lessons for us as a society. The greatest lesson is that Jesus does not turn away from those who are suffering from psychological illness. The Gospel of Mark, we've looked at only 2 stories. There are many more stories of Jesus responding to people who are possessed by spirits. And I think that's the challenge for our society today. It's not just the physical coronavirus pandemic, but now I think we are beginning to comprehend that there are psychological diseases, psychological pandemics that require all of our spiritual and political will and resources to address. Pastor Charlie, I see I've reached the end of my time. Do we have a moment for a couple of responses, questions?
Sure. Absolutely.
Well, I'll leave that with you all to think about this coming week. Next week, and I should say, pass on the message from Sharon, Happy Father's Day. Indeed, it has been and will be a Happy Father's Day for me, I can tell you that. Next week will be our last session together, and it's the most important of all, because it turns out that underneath Jesus' response to disease is his response to death. So I hope you'll all come back next week. We had a good crowd today. And Pastor Charlie, you and I will evaluate whether we were successful with me connecting from home, or whether it's better for me to come back into the church.
We will talk. Yep, absolutely. And we wish you all a very happy Father's Day as well, and wish you God's blessings. Thank you, Dr. Welborn.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone. Such good comments today.
Thank you.